Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, John Rees. On tonight's programme, we'll be looking at drone warfare after an apology from US President Barack Obama for the death of 2 innocents killed by the pilotless planes. And we'll also be looking back at the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh 2 years ago. But first, 2 controversial anniversaries are being remembered today. The Battle of Gallipoli in World War I and the even more controversial massacre of Armenians living in the former Ottoman Empire. The debate as to whether it was a genocide has divided opinion ever since. Afzal Ahmed has more.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan today hosted several leaders from the former Allied powers of World War I. This to pay tribute to the hundreds of thousands killed in the Battle of Gallipoli, which will mark its 100-year anniversary tomorrow. The 9-month battle on April 25, 1915, saw German-backed Ottoman forces resist Allied soldiers trying to break through to the capital Constantinople and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The battle ended with up to 500,000 casualties, with little achieved on the ground, but it played a significant role in forming modern Turkey and the young nations of Australia and New Zealand. While Turkey commemorates its anniversary to send a message of reconciliation to its former enemies, other commemorations are happening across the border and around the world for the mass killings of Armenians by Ottoman authorities during the same period. In the Armenian capital of Yerevan, delegations including the presidents of France, Russia, Serbia and Cyprus took part in memorial events to mourn the dead. The event is widely debated but is viewed by many historians as genocide. Modern Turkey, the successor to the Ottoman Empire, strongly rejects the charge, saying the death toll has been inflated and that those killed were victims of civil war and unrest. Armenia wants other countries to recognize the killings as genocide, and the debate has long soured its relations with Turkey.
Recognition of the genocide is not the world's tribute to the Armenian people and our martyrs. Recognition of the genocide is a triumph of a human conscience and justice over intolerance and hatred.
To date, more than 20 countries have recognized the killings as genocide. The juxtaposition of the dates have aroused heavy emotions in the lead-up to the anniversaries, with Armenians accusing Turkey of shifting the main Gallipoli event forward by 1 day, from Saturday to Friday, to deliberately overshadow the Yerevan ceremonies. In February, Armenia withdrew from parliament landmark peace accords with Turkey that had only been signed in 2009, setting back US-backed efforts to bury a century of hostility between the neighbours. Armenian President Serzi Sargsyan said he was ready to normalize relations with Turkey, stating that there should be no preconditions in restarting the peace process and would not insist that the Turks accept they'd committed genocide. Turkey also kicked up a diplomatic storm this month when it recalled its envoy to the Vatican after Pope Francis described the killings as the first genocide of the 20th century. This week, Turkey also recalled its ambassador to Vienna after Austrian lawmakers called the massacre a genocide. Afzal Ahmed, The Report.
Well, joining me to discuss that story is Dr Simon Waldman from King's College London, who is the co-author of a forthcoming book, The New Turkey and Its Discontents. Welcome to the programme. Let's just talk about the scale of this massacre. I mean, recently Perry Anderson's been writing in the London Review of Books saying that the estimates vary between 1.2 and 1.4 million. These are huge numbers, aren't they?
They are huge numbers, and 1.2 million, 1.4 million is only one side of the disparity of estimate in terms of numbers. From the Turkish nationalist side, they would say, well, in terms of how many Armenians were killed, we're talking about 300,000 in the context of a larger, broader warfare where communities from both sides perished. In the case of historians who kind of fit more of the Armenian narrative, they would say anywhere around 1.2 to 1.5 million were killed during the Armenian Genocide. So these are essentially the numbers, the figures that historians have to play with. And of course, it's tough. And
your judgment, I mean, we understand, and we'll come on to the way in which it's still a hugely disputed political matter today. But in your judgment, what would be the kind of correct ballpark estimate?
Okay, well, in my judgment, let me put the cards right on the table, so to speak. My opinion is, in terms of the events that took place in 1915 all the way to World War I, do they constitute as genocide towards the Armenian people? In my opinion, the answer is yes. In terms of the actual number and the figure, I think that's something which is less interesting, if I'm honest with you. That's something that could be figured out in terms of the full opening of archival material and things like that. And until I see that, the full disclosure of documents, I'm not willing to make such estimates. Some of the problems in terms of the numbers are, Ottoman estimates of different census reports and things like that, which weren't totally accurate, and some would say they are accurate. And of course, that's where you have different accounts, also outside observers estimating how many Armenians lived in certain populations. And of course, you've got this big question mark. But without all the documentations, it's hard to say. Now, I just said a minute ago that the way I see it is it was a genocide. But what I also see as something which is very difficult is that I think many Turks are concerned that if the world recognizes genocide, if Turkey itself recognizes that this is a genocide, some of the suffering that Muslims, Ottoman Muslims who would become Turks, had during World War I will somehow be nullified. They will be forgotten. And it's important that we also acknowledge that many Muslim Turks also suffered during World War I as well.
Okay, let's just, before we get on to the, the exact political sensitivities and how that plays out today, let's just sort of give viewers the context of these two anniversaries, because the Battle of Gallipoli and the massacre of the Armenians are happening more or less at the same time. So the Allied powers are landing on Gallipoli. It's a disastrous military operation, and at the same time in the interior this is taking place. Just put those two things together for us.
Indeed. Okay, so what's happening in terms of the Ottoman Empire, this important participant of World War I, is that it's facing an existential crisis. So it's joined World War I, it wants to maintain itself as an empire, but it's facing a battle against other empires. Namely, in the context of these two battles, the British, and of course the different Commonwealth powers that's associated with the different troops in Gallipoli, and also Russia and Russian ambitions and expansionism. And at the same time, to make it even more complicated, you have different nationalist movements trying to maneuver and create their own nation at the same time. So that's what's happening, especially in terms of Armenian nationalism in the east, in some cases with Russian support, and then at the same time, or around the same time, the Ottomans are fighting this battle against the British, supported by Anzac troops, that land in Gallipoli, which you're absolutely right, was a complete disaster for the British Empire.
So would it be true to say that just as the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews accelerated the worse the situation got for the Nazis in the war, that this was something which was also a dynamic at work for the Ottoman Empire?
I'm not sure if I would go as that far. One of the things which I'm concerned about when it comes to discussions about the Armenian genocide, or any genocide does that matter, is comparisons with the Holocaust. Indeed, the Holocaust was a severe genocide, and when we think of genocide, we think of probably the Holocaust. It's probably the first that comes into our minds. But that doesn't mean that all genocides are the same, or they followed the same pattern. Some of them are very distinct. There's unique characteristics in terms of the Holocaust, and there's unique characteristics when it comes to the Armenian genocide. In the case of the Holocaust in World War II, in terms of transportation of Jews into concentration camps using the railroads, this is to a point where it's a hindrance on the German war effort. When it comes to the Armenian genocide, was the deportations of Armenians from their villages in the east of Turkey into the deserts of Syria a military necessity? Yeah, it's an argument that could be made. Was it more of a necessity than it was for transporting Jews in Europe? Well, yes, there was an insurgency by some Armenians supported by the Russians. So that was a significant security concern.
Okay, and let's move on to some of the modern kind of echoes and remembrances of this. Obviously, the Turkish state is committed to the remembrance of Gallipoli. How important was that experience in the creation of the modern Turkish state?
Oh, it's absolutely fundamental. I mean, it's very interesting that you mentioned that. I was having this conversation with one of my PhD students, actually, Aslihan Agolu, and we were talking about how Turkey remembers World War I. And, it becomes quite clear that, you can't really look at the World War I and how it's seen in Turkey without also bringing in the Turkish War of Independence and the nationalist struggle. So for many Turks, the events which happened from 1919 to 1923, the founding of the modern Republic of Turkey, is very much linked to the catastrophe which happened, for the Ottoman Empire in World War I, namely the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. In the case of the Gallipoli, this was one of the only major campaigns which the Ottoman army was successful during the whole war. And it was the commanders of this campaign which then went on to lead this nationalist struggle against the different invading powers of Anatolia later in the War of Independence for Turkey. And the two are very much part of the same narrative. If it were not for the success of Ottoman troops in Gallipoli, then there wouldn't have really have been this kind of drive to follow someone such as Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and some of his friends associates in this War of Independence that later founded the Republic.
So are some of the accusations that are now being levelled at the way in which these commemorations are being working, are they accurate in the sense that some people are saying that the Turkish state is magnifying or foregrounding the commemoration of Gallipoli for the purposes of marginalising the memory of the Armenian massacre?
Well, what's happened right now, and remembering Gallipoli and the campaign and the centenary and everything, is important within itself. So in terms of remembering 100 years since Gallipoli, of course the Turkish Republic is right to make a big deal out of this. And also remembering those who lost their lives, and this includes the Anzac Day and things of that nature as well, and the loss of lives of troops from Australia and New Zealand. So that's absolutely important. But what Turkey did was they switched the day of this kind of making a big remembrance day of the Gallipoli to the same time as the Armenian Genocide was going to be commemorated. And by doing that, they did certainly try to make political capital. And you have lobbyists for both the Turkish side and the Armenian side essentially having this PR battle on the international arena to try and get almost their narratives to be accepted by the international community. And from a historian's perspective, this is unfortunate. I like to see historical events being discussed for the purpose of history and what happened and why things happened as they did, as opposed to being politicized. And that's sadly what both sides have done.
So there's been a breakdown, hasn't there? The Armenians have withdrawn from some of the peace process that was set up, partly in the wake of Austria and others recognising the genocide. So is it now? Is actually this memory corroding the possibility of normalising those relationships?
I mean, it's certainly a factor when it comes to Armenian-Turkish relations today. And unfortunately, the protocol, which was agreed upon, and hasn't been ratified by the parliaments of each country. And yes, the Armenian genocide, the events in World War I is certainly an important component of that. But I would actually fear the kind of modern repercussions of that more than what happened in the past, looking forward to what's happening in the future. Don't forget, Armenia, for example, has this struggle with Azerbaijan. It occupies certain territory which belongs to Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is arming itself to the teeth. Armenia has some powerful friends, and Turkey is a crucial element and perhaps a potential for a positive development in just reducing tensions, because I fear that this kind of issue and this tension between Azerbaijan, very much an ally of Turkey, and Armenia is going to heat up in the future. And some kind of agreement, treaty between Turkey and Armenia would do wonders in solving that issue too.
Well, one last question, just to bring this question of the way in which these historical events are reflected and distorted perhaps by modern politics. We've had a lot in this country about remembering World War I. Gallipoli was a standing disaster. A supposed national hero, Winston Churchill, was closely involved in this. Perhaps that disaster might be laid at his door. Not much talked about here, is it?
I do find myself quite surprised that it hasn't been talked about. I've been looking through the newspapers, searching all the time for how much. It's been discussed a bit, but not that much. And I think part of the reason is we did in the UK look at World War I very much last year. It's almost as if we have World War I fatigue. We had the documentaries and all on the television channels. We've had the biographies of people such as T. Lawrence and Churchill come out, and all different accounts of World War I. And it's now like tired. And let's not forget, I mean, when it comes to the Gallipoli campaign, this is a period of British history that a lot of people would rather forget. It's kind of a tendency to celebrate successes and victories and kind of, have amnesia about dismal disasters, especially when war heroes make huge catastrophic mistakes, such as Churchill.
Yeah, OK. Dr Simon Waldman, thanks very much for joining us, but we're going to have to leave that discussion there. We will be back after the break, however, with the rest of the day's news and what you've been saying on Twitter. Do rejoin us.